Good morning. My name is Heidi Hess-Weber, and I am a member of the Sacred Grounds Project here at Oseh Shalom, and also a resident of Laurel. And I'm going to introduce Jimmy Rogers, who is a resident of Laurel and a passionate native gardener. He's turned his passion into helping people to actually plant native. He's turned that into a native garden consultancy called Vibrant Gardening. And so today Jimmy's going to talk about building a vibrant garden. Jimmy helps homeowners and organizations to turn their landscapes and their turf grass into gardens that support butterflies, bees, and other pollinators. He also specializes in sourcing plants from places in Maryland so that we know when we order plants through Jimmy that we're getting the real thing and not some kind of a hybrid or something that came from Kansas. If you live in Laurel, you may also know Jimmy's name because he writes a monthly column for the Laurel Independent. And I just have to, on a personal note, say that Jimmy was instrumental in getting me started in native gardening. He actually came to my house and said, here's some plants, put this one here and this one here and this one here, and that got me started. So I have a personal appreciation for his talent. So here's Jimmy Rogers.
Thank you for that introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks to Oseh Shalom for inviting me and hosting this talk. Happy to be here speaking with you, especially on my favorite topic, native plants and gardening for wildlife. Also, I want to congratulate your congregation on multiple years as a Sacred Grounds House of Worship, especially to your committee who's kept things going all these years. So that's a great accomplishment. Today we're going to go through some introductions and then dive into the hows and whys of creating your own vibrant garden. After that, we'll answer any questions we have time for. I'm actually pretty available today and happy to do follow-up conversations. Also, I have a list of questions that were submitted ahead of time, so I'll try to address those first. And also, just so everyone's aware, I'll be sharing these slides and a handout with our hosts. And there's a lot of resources in there and references you may want to look through at home. So you don't have to write everything down unless something particularly piques your interest. And I believe that we're also recording, so we will have that as well. So as you heard, my name is Jimmy Rogers. I'm a native gardener in Laurel, Maryland. In my day job, I'm a project manager, which is convenient because gardening and planning go hand in hand. I'm also a certified Chesapeake Bay landscape professional, or CBLP, which covers the intersection between gardening, landscaping, ecology, and stormwater management. I'm the gardens project manager for our local ecological group here, Laurel for the Patuxent. L4P is a nonprofit that works to conserve the Patuxent River as well as its watershed, which includes all the homes and woods and animals and plants in and around the greater Laurel area. Also, if you live in that Laurel area, you might get that Laurel Independent, so my column's in there, as Heidi mentioned. And lastly, it might surprise some of you that I'm the president of a small HOA, Patuxent Triangle. Most folks see HOAs as against conservation-oriented landscaping. However, that's starting to change, both due to Maryland's state law allowing residents to garden for wildlife in HOAs, full stop, and because HOAs themselves are beginning to realize that there are benefits to better water and land management practices. So after several years of learning and volunteering as much as I could, I realized the only way I could possibly do more was to start a business. So that's why I started Vibrant Gardening. Originally, I thought I'd want to design and build gardens like a typical landscaping company, but I quickly realized that if I did everything for people, my clients wouldn't know about their new plants, how to take care of them, or how to curate the garden over time. So I stopped selling gardens and started working with homeowners to help them become native gardeners. I offer on-site and virtual consultations, as well as design and project management services. And as Heidi mentioned, I'm also a licensed plant dealer, so I can source plants from the wholesale growers in Maryland and deliver plants to people that they might otherwise have a hard time finding, which includes some local ecotype varieties, in fact, a growing number. All right, so why is it called vibrant gardening? I chose the name very carefully. So whenever we're in the growing season, I spend a lot of time walking through my garden. I like to see the foliage and blooms. It's also exciting to see what new plants are coming up each week. However, for me, the plants are just the first layer of the garden. As soon as I wake up, I see our native bees busily gathering pollen and nectar. All these pictures are from my front yard, unless they're otherwise tagged. Butterflies are also attracted to my garden. In fact, I see at least 10 species of butterfly each year, plus the leaves, under the leaves are all their caterpillars. And while we might not see them as much, there are tons of moths and their young as well. All of this attracts tons of songbirds looking for insects or seeds, depending on the time of year. And there are countless other animals like skinks, and now several generations of bunnies have grown up pretty much exclusively in my front yard. Like, they're right there, I see them every day. So when I say vibrant, I mean the combination of animals and their host plants that bring my garden to life. So, how can you add vibrancy to your own garden? Well, what I'll be sharing today are my personal principles for approaching native gardening. We're going to step through them one at a time, but for the audiophiles in the room, I'm going to read them out loud. So, garden for wildlife, take responsibility for stewarding your land, take cues from the environment, learn the facts from objective sources, pursue your projects at a sustainable and healthy pace, and gift your time, knowledge, and plants to others. If you approach gardening this way, I guarantee you will bring more life into your garden than you could ever buy at a nursery. So, the first step is to garden for wildlife. Before we can even begin thinking about the garden, we need to understand some details about our ecosystem. So let's start with native plants. To make sure we're clear on terms, native plants are plants that naturally occur in a place. That means we need to define first where we are ecologically. Many folks are familiar with the USDA plant hardiness zones like 6B, 7A. However, those zones stretch all the way across the country and don't say much about the unique ecology of our area. Native gardeners tend to focus on their watershed and their ecoregions. Maryland, which is kind of here within the larger Chesapeake Bay watershed. Is that showing up on your screen? No? Okay. Here we go. Try that again. So Maryland within the larger Chesapeake Bay watershed. So almost every drop of water that lands in Maryland eventually gets into the bay. And then from there, Maryland is divided into three ecoregions: the coastal plain, the Piedmont, and the mountain region. If you look at the map, you can see that there's a little red X here. That's where Laurel is, and you can see we're positioned right on the line between the coastal plain and the Piedmont. That means broadly, Laurel's native plants are the plants that scientists have observed as native to those two Maryland ecoregions, coastal plain and the Piedmont. All right. So the easiest way to understand how native plants drive the rest of the ecosystem is by looking at examples. Native violets, over here on the left, hopefully some of you are seeing those in your yard right now, are native to Maryland and an excellent early season bloomer. They host the caterpillar of the fritillary butterfly. Here we see the adult on a butterfly milkweed, which is their favorite nectar source. They're important pollinators, and humans love them. This picture is from my front yard, and I can tell you I'm always delighted every year to see them. Native winterberry hosts the caterpillar of the Harris's three-spotted moth. From this stage, it will either become a moth or it will become prey for a bluebird feeding its young. Caterpillars, particularly moth caterpillars, are the most important food source for baby birds, who can only eat live prey, no bird seed or anything like that. So what if we try to use common non-native plants instead? So if we replace the violets with liriope, which is from Asia and has no host relationships with our insects, it will produce no fritillaries or other butterflies. If we replace our winterberry with nandina, which is also from Asia, there will be no host for our moth caterpillar. So that means there's no moths in the adult form, and there's no food for songbirds. In fact, nandina has berries that are toxic to our songbirds, and cedar waxwings are known to gobble them up without knowing the danger, which can lead to their deaths. And this is about where we are today. Most of our gardens are made up of non-native plants, so a breakdown of the ecosystem has been happening more and more. In the last 50 years, we've lost about a third of our birds. So you might say to yourself, well, this is all too bad, but that's what the woods are for. Wildlife lives there and then comes and visits our bird feeders and some of our plants. And you'd be absolutely right if we hadn't disrupted or destroyed about 95% of the original habitat in the United States. So unless we do something different going forward, we're going to lose most of our insects, birds, and other residential wildlife. What I've just shared is an absolute tip of the iceberg. If you're interested in learning more, I recommend either reading Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home or watching one of the many, many recordings of his talk, Nature's Best Hope. Most of the native gardeners that I know have read the book, and it lays out the problem we're facing with what kinds of home gardening practices have been shown to actually make a difference. Okay. So, we understand a little bit about the important role that native plants play in supporting wildlife. What's next? For any garden, you first need to identify plants by their light, moisture, and soil requirements. There are many more details that you will eventually learn, but these will always steer you in the general right direction. For light, I consider full sun to be strong light at least half the day. If there are any trees casting partial shade, then it's part sun or part shade. I don't really distinguish between those two terms. If there's a lot of shade throughout the day, either because it's blocked by a structure or there's heavy tree canopy, then it's full shade. Fortunately, many natives are very adaptable and can survive in more shade than expected. And if they're in a moist environment, they may also be able to survive more sun than expected. So it's really even more just sun and shade that I personally focus on. For moisture, I tend to always assume a spot is dry until I've seen evidence that I'm wrong. If it's rained a few days ago and the soil is still wet to the touch, then it's a moist spot. If the ground is actually squishy, there is often water when you press on the ground, I would call that wet. If you have an area like a rain garden or that periodically holds water, or even if you have a pond, you might look for plants that can tolerate or even thrive in full inundation. Lastly, I don't spend too much time on soil types simply because there is so much complexity to soil, and many plants can tolerate a lot of soil conditions. The main thing I check for is whether a plant is predominantly found in sand, even some are found in sand dunes, or if it's noted to be particularly intolerant of clay. Those are kind of two ends of the extremes. For those who often give clay a bad rap, though, remember that we have tons and tons of clay-loving natives to choose from. Kind of on that line, please do not start a gardening project by immediately amending the soil with compost, fertilizer, or anything else. If you're gardening with native plants, the best strategy is to find the plants that already want to live in your soil. To put it another way, no one's out in the wild amending that soil, so you probably don't need to either. All right, if you've chosen an area to plant and identified the conditions, you need to choose some plants. You can start by making a list of interesting native plants to try out in your garden, or by going somewhere that sells native plants and looking around. There are some pitfalls to avoid while shopping. First thing to know is that seeing native on a pot or plant tag tells you next to nothing. Most big box stores or even fancy garden centers are roughly selling native plants for a region, or even maybe they're just native somewhere in the United States. If I go down to a native plant selection at a typical nursery or section of a typical nursery, I could probably identify about half of them as not necessarily being native to Maryland by a couple different measures. Fortunately, we have a new program in Maryland called the Maryland's Best Native Plants Program. It's part of the Maryland's Best kind of agricultural brand, and it serves two purposes. First, it's just starting to identify retailers and growers that are growing plants that are actually native to Maryland, and that's just starting, so be patient, but they're working on that program now. And they also compiled a very good list of plants native to Maryland, along with lots of information about each plant. There's a link to that in the Quick Start guide I'll be providing to you after the presentation, but frankly, it's become my primary source going forward. A friend of mine who's a botanist put it together, so I have a lot of confidence. So as best as you can, try to choose plants that are native to Maryland. Next, try to buy straight species, which are varieties that are close to what is found in the wild. Most of the nursery trade is made up of cultivars, which are selections of special flowers, leaves, and growth patterns. Usually they'll have a cute marketing name like October Skies, in quotes. While there are some cultivars that seem to be valuable for wildlife, many break the million-year relationships they have with our wildlife. I'll come back to this in a little bit. And if you can, try to find growers in Maryland. You've heard shop local for everything else, but why not native plants of all things, right? Even better, with a local grower, you have a chance of finding local ecotype plants, which means they are more genetically like the plants found in our local areas. Believe it or not, native bees in Maryland actually have a preference for plants with local genetic traits. Plus, no one's going to be able to give you better advice than a local grower of local plants. Above all, the best practices above on this screen are just practices. They're not rules. I recommend you aim for them, do the best you can, and then like everything else, you'll probably not get it 100% right, and that's okay. The most important thing is to know what to do and why, and then aim in the right direction when you can. So let's do a quick side-by-side comparison. This flower on the left is quite striking. There are red petals, a yellow center, and the leaves and stems are a dark purple, almost black sometimes. It's a cultivar of our native false sunflower, Heliopsis helianthoides. Here's what the straight species looks like. You'll notice the petals are bright yellow and the stems are a more typical color of dark green rather than sort of black. That means the bees and butterflies that have a relationship with false sunflower may not as easily recognize the flowers on the cultivar. And it may not even be producing nectar or pollen. Plus, the dark leaves are caused by some kind of pigment, which almost definitely is toxic to our local caterpillars, beetles, and other leaf eaters. Also, in all the years I've grown the plant on the left, it has never made any more of its kind. That's because it's almost certainly a sterile cultivar. Compare that to the one on the right. I now have a huge stand of those in front of my front porch, which would never have happened if it was sterile. And I got the straight species from a neighbor for free. So, you know, this is really how we want to run our gardens. So while striking, the one on the left is ecologically about as useful as these. And these are what Doug Tallamy refers to a lot of times as non-contributors to our environment. They're plastic plants. And this is true for non-native species as well. All right. It's challenging to find native plants. This is me, trunk full of plants, driving around, which is me twice a year. While a few mainstream nurseries have some natives at the level of quality you'll want, mostly you'll want to source plants from one of the following options. Mail order is often the most efficient. However, you're often ordering plants from out of state. There's no chance of local ecotype. And also there's usually a significant minimum quantity. So it can be a lot more expensive for the beginner. During spring and fall, there's some very good pop-up sales, which you can usually find on the Maryland Native Plant Society website. It helps to order ahead, so you can just pick up everything you need. And I will say single sales may have limited species. It is kind of what's there is what's there, so bring a list. One of the best options you can choose is to buy from a brick and mortar native plant retailer, which you can often find out more details about the plants, how they were grown, practices used by the nursery. So that's often a good thing. And then lastly, you can partner with someone like myself who has a plant dealer license and sells out of the wholesale plant trade. Part of the idea behind Vibrant Gardening is that I can go to several Maryland native plant growers, get almost anything I want, and then deliver those plants to customers. Every year, though, the Maryland wholesalers are improving their stock for the retail market, and so it is making sourcing easier regardless of how you shop. And click. There we go. If you're just starting out, a great option are native plant shares, which are starting right now. Like every weekend through May is basically, there are plant shares. These are community-led gatherings of gardeners who have extra plants in their gardens or sometimes grow plants specifically for the event. They want to share with others, so they are generally not swaps, meaning you don't need to bring anything to get something. In fact, a lot of gardeners will usually encourage you to take a lot of stuff because provided you promise to plant it, they don't want to take it back home because then what do they do with it then? So they want you to take the plants. I've personally made a ton of friends at these events. It's also nice to look at a plant and remember who gave it to you or see your own plants growing in someone's garden. I know some of y'all already have that experience. And you can find a pretty good list of plant shares at, again, the Maryland Native Plant Society website, mdflora.org. Again, it's all in the handout. Also, the vast majority of these are posted on Facebook, so I recommend doing a search there. Okay, I know that that was a lot of information, and I want to be clear, no one expects you to absorb this all at once. The main takeaway is that native plants drive the rest of our ecosystem. So if you plant them in your garden, you will actually help your local wildlife. Full stop. Once you have that mindset, you can move on to the second principle, and we will kind of move through these quicker as we go. The first one is a big bite. So, second principle, take responsibility for stewarding your land. This means that if you own a piece of land, you don't just live there, you're responsible for what happens to the other living things that are there as well. Before starting a new garden project, I recommend you become familiar with everything that's already on your property. Get one of the mini phone apps, I like PlantNet, and start identifying everything as well as you can. This time of year is tough because we have a lot of false or non-true leaves, but once you have a nice flush of a plant, you can usually ID it. Flowers make it even easier. If you visit one of the Maryland Native Gardening groups on Facebook, they'll also help you identify tricky plants. So I did that a lot my first few years. If you have any trees on your property, I recommend you not only identify them, but but for the natives in particular, make sure they're healthy. Have an arborist out, which costs nothing for a consult, and ask them for some professional advice. A 70-year-old tree is going to do a lot more important things for our ecosystem than 10 saplings you might plant as an adult for human spans of lifetime. You also might already have more native species on your property than you think. I worked with the Laurel Museum on their gardens, and as you can see in this before picture, they had a willow oak, they had several winterberry hollies, and I helped build their garden around that, and it told me certain things about their garden that those plants were happy. Even common violets make new butterflies, and letting them bloom in your lawn in April will help early season bees. Also, anything that's already growing on your land is something to pay attention to in the future when planting gardens. You can also start to identify invasive species on your property. Here you can see a huge amount of invasive English ivy that's creeping up the walls of the museum. And lastly, if you have any water issues with erosion or ponding on your property, those are good things to look into before creating new garden beds. Otherwise, you might have to undo your own work later. Let's clarify what we mean by invasive species. They're any species that is not native to an area and causes harm to people, wildlife, or the economy. So it's a hefty term. The term is sometimes used, though, informally by gardeners to mean it spreads rapidly, but that leads to a lot of confusion. So I strongly recommend using aggressive or even gregarious is popular when talking about fast-spreading native plants or fast-spreading plants of any kind. So now that we have a clear definition of invasive, let's talk about how they impact our forests. Most of them simply grow out of control. Porcelainberry above and kudzu below are both problems along the Patuxent River here, and they will block any light from reaching the forest canopy, let alone anything below it. Even before they get that big, though, they'll start causing diseases on the plants that they cover. Often I hear the phrase, "Oh, but this one is so pretty." And here they are. This is porcelainberry. Almost all of our invasives were brought here because that's how they look, is pretty. We got to learn to love the thousands of beautiful native plants we have here instead. There are also many invasive shrubs for sale in Maryland nurseries, such as barberry, which I'm personally seeing cover a quarter mile of what once was wild meadow. They also breed ticks, so not great to have near your house. If any of that sounds like a problem, there are some clear actions to make sure your yard doesn't make things even worse. Do not buy native invasive plants. Identify them where they are already in place. As much as you are able, remove them and dispose of them properly. Replace them with native plant species. This last one is important because if you leave bare ground, you're inviting any seeds dropped by that invasive to all germinate at once. Native plants are sometimes very effective in slowing the reoccurrence of invasive species when planted in their place. There's a handout, like I said, that has information about this, but also the Maryland Extension is a really good resource for identifying and eliminating invasives. All right, maybe some positive news, palate cleanser. Fortunately, everyone here can participate in the Baywise program. I bet some of you already have, which is a much broader look at your outdoor space, covering not only your garden areas, but also turf grass, stormwater management, and other environmental considerations. It's a free program for homeowners, and at the end, your yard will be certified as Baywise, which is also a great way to show curious neighbors, yes, I put some thought into this new garden that you're seeing, even if it looks a little weird. I really enjoyed doing Baywise myself, and even though I had done a lot of research, I definitely learned some things from them during the site visit. And again, there's links in the handout. So, I'll kind of wrap up stewardship with 4 practices that you can go home and start doing today if you're not already doing them. In the fall, look for opportunities to leave the leaves. This is where our pollinators overwinter and fireflies go to overwinter. So rake leaves out of pathways so that you're not creating a hazard and into your garden beds. Let leaves accumulate on your lawn as long as you can see the blades of the grass poking through to allow for gas exchange. They will break down over the succeeding months. In the spring, resist cleaning up too much in the garden too early. Let the garden sleep in until the nights are reliably in the 50s. So I just did my cutback. I leave my leaf litter indefinitely. It's doing lots of good work for us. And cut stems to knee height in late March and leave them for stem nesting bees, which is about 20% of our native bees are stem nesters. So it's good to leave some stems there. Also, don't lose your mind over it. They're just stems. There's lots of stems in the world, but if you leave some, it's good. Make sure exterior lights are bird friendly. Lights that shine up into the sky are not only wasting light, but it also confuses migratory birds, and this has been shown to lead to their deaths. Make sure lights are shielded and don't use upward facing lights that you might use for like illuminating trees at night. Avoid pesticides. Herbicides and insecticides fall into that umbrella term, except in rare spot applications. So don't broadcast weed and feed on your lawn, and do not hire mosquito spray companies as they kill large numbers of beneficial insects, including pollinators. Okay, so we know what a native plant is, we know how to take care of our land, we're ready to start designing a garden. I know we're like 37 minutes in, we're just starting with garden design, but a lot of the work is done for you because now you understand how plants work a little bit, and they will do a lot of the work in the design process. However, before we get into the design, I don't want to direct us toward Italian gardens from 200 years ago. I want us to take cues from the environment for design inspiration. So here we have sort of a meadow with a little bit of forest verge heading into forest. So first thing that I'm trying to think about in a new garden is whether I'm trying to mimic a forest, verge, or meadow. Forests have big canopy trees, usually a lot of shade, and often there aren't an enormous number of plants growing at ground level. Meadow is the kind of grassland we tend to have here in Maryland. These tend to have grasses and herbaceous plants and the occasional tree or shrub. And in between these two landscapes is verge. They're not usually super deep. It's a really interesting transition zone where there's more shrubs and understory trees connecting the meadow to the forest. And this is actually a big gap in our gardens because developers cut down the forest and then stop abruptly and at like a new tree line that they've created, and then put down grass right to the forest edge. So our natural landscapes have more of a gradation, and a great goal for a native gardening project is to rebuild that gradation if your house backs up into the woods. All right. Once I know what I'm trying to mimic, I can start to inform my plant choices. The first plants I focus on are ground covers. These are usually semi-evergreens, stay relatively low, and form enough foliage to prevent weed seeds from germinating in early spring. They're particularly important in meadow-like gardens, where the amount of sun means lots of energy for weeds to feed on. Here are some go-to examples I use in almost every garden where they're appropriate. On the left is Pachyra aurea, which can handle a lot of conditions except very dry, very hot environments. I lost a bunch of this during the drought last summer. In the middle are plantain leaf pussy toes, Antennaria plantaginifolia, which can handle very dry, sunny climates. I caught an American painted lady butterfly laying eggs on her host plant. And on the right are golden alexanders, Zizia aurea, that can handle very dry, sunny conditions and will bloom throughout most of the year. They host black swallowtails, the butterfly. And if you plant a ground cover, every 1 to 2 feet in a new garden, they will claim the ground and you won't need to add mulch every year. Without a ground cover layer, you're not only opening yourself up to a lot of weed pressure, your garden will also not resemble a native landscape. Here's another design tip. If you're designing a garden with walkways, it is important that plants aren't leaping toward passersby. So an example here on the left is a beautiful patch of black-eyed Susans that are leaning into the sidewalk. For many of us gardeners, this isn't a huge deal, but for folks who have only seen formal gardens, it can evoke a sense of disorder. Also, when you intrude on public spaces such as sidewalks, we want to be mindful of folks who might have a harder time using a sidewalk if it's blocked by floppy stems. So when you are standing on the edge, of a bed, look at what you've planted 1 foot in, or what you've planned to plant 1 foot in, and make sure it won't grow more than 1 foot tall, because then it'll flop over. 2 feet in, make sure it won't grow more than 2 feet tall, and so on. I've also seen this example on the right with the Friends School of Baltimore, where they weed the first 6 inches, cover it with mulch, and then pretty much let the rest of the garden go wild with these stanchions. And it's very effective. And that's in the fall at the height of its growth. There is a huge amount of very mediocre gardening information out there. Most of it comes from bad patterns started in gardening and landscaping industries, and then they make their way into books and blogs and TV specials. The number of invasive species that are top sellers at nurseries is a good example of this. If you're going to have a vibrant garden, you have to know the facts and learn them from objective sources. Unfortunately, many ecologists are working very hard, many ecologists are working very hard to get their findings out to as many people as they possibly can and in an actionable format. Here's an example of how objective facts help me, not only with clients, but also with friends and neighbors. Various invasive species like butterfly bush, vinca, clematis, nandina, come up in conversation or during a visit to someone's garden, and folks invariably say, I know you don't like these, but. I hear that like a lot. And here's the thing, I've spent non-trivial amount of time removing these plants from home gardens and from the woods surrounding them. However, it's not because I don't like them. It's because ecologists have measured the damage they do to our environment, wrote up papers, and then stood on the mountaintops shouting and hoping someone else would care about this. And I should add, they didn't get paid enough to do that. Believe it or not, there are some native plants I don't like, at least I don't like the look of them, but I tend to, and I don't tend to plant them in gardens. But if someone asks me about that plant, I can say, yes, there are 3 different pollinators that need that plant to survive. And it's not just the case, and that's not just the case for non-native plants. And that situation is not the case for non-native plants, let alone non-native invasive plants. So it's not about liking plants or not liking them. The plants are just the plants. They're from wherever they're from. All of these plants have an important role in their ecosystem where they're from. They're just damaging here. On the handout, you're going to find a ton of great books, which most of which are also great audiobooks. Here's a short selection that had a big impact on me. I already mentioned Bringing Nature Home. Our Native Bees is a deep dive into both Eurasian honeybees and everything you could possibly want to know about native bees. And they differ a lot from honeybees. I found the design concepts in Planting in a Post-Wild World to be very useful. It's important to read classics like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. It's particularly important to us locals as the pesticide research cited in the book was done about 30 minutes from here at the Patuxent Research Refuge. Another classic, I think I could read a Sand County Almanac by Aldo Leopold about 100 more times. It's just a very meditative way to think about our natural landscapes. And I want to mention Nancy Lawson, who is a Howard County native gardener and an amazing observer of wildlife in the home garden. She also has a fabulous garden and is a very nice person. I humbly submit my own articles for your reference. I try to answer a lot of common questions that I've gotten over the years. About 2 years of articles right now. And then the last, kind of objective source piece of information is nativity, aka whether something is native to a particular place. It's pretty tricky for new gardeners to figure out. So there's 2 really good resources. NativePlantCenter.net it's really a redirect, but it's easy to remember. And also the new commercially available native plants list from the Extension Service. The latter is likely more accurate, but it might be a little overwhelming if you haven't dived into plants much before. And if you're a nativity nerd like me, FloraQuest is a wonderful phone app you buy once, and then you can reference range maps for species in our region. And lastly, I do want to warn people, if you've ever Googled up native range after a species name, and you've gotten a website called Bonap, I recommend avoiding it. There's just a lot of incorrect information in there. It's like an aggregation of different types of data, and it's just been replaced by better resources in subsequent years. Okay, we're gonna wrap up really quick here. Once you're getting started, you need to pursue your projects at a sustainable and healthy pace. In other words, take very small bites. And I'll give you a contrast. You can design an entirely new garden to go in your front yard bring in 20 cubic yards of arborist wood chip, smother for 5 weeks, and then have an 8-hour planting marathon on your birthday, and get this to happen after one of the most interesting years of your life. But that really isn't the most sustainable best project for most people. You might get halfway through the project, get overwhelmed and run out of steam, and now you have a mulch yard. So I tend to recommend projects of 100 to 300 square feet for folks creating new gardens beds, especially if you're trying to smother lawn first, turf grass lawn. So here's a good example of that size of bed. It's a design for part of a HOA garden project that I led, and a picture of the first spring. You don't need to be a graphic artist or landscape architect to write down where you're going to plant native plants. One of my biggest takeaways from working at a digital design agency was to spend as little time and money as possible on design documents. While design is super important, all designs undergo change, sometimes significant change by the time they become like a real tangible product. So getting designs good enough to start building something has to be the primary goal. Regardless of your background, your 100th design is going to be better than your first. So I advocate for designing lots of small gardens so you can build your skills. For my garden designs, and this is something people are willing to pay for, I plan out planting plans in 1-foot squares in Google Sheets because it gets the job done. Last principle isn't so complicated. Once you can do something, gift your time helping others. Once you know something, gift your knowledge to help others solve problems. And once you have grown lots and lots of plants, which is going to happen in a native garden, gift those plants to others who are building their own gardens. All right, that's the principles. There were some submitted questions ahead of time, so I'm going to try to answer those. Some of them might be better like conversations afterwards, so I'm happy to talk to you after the talk, or also follow up on email. Y'all can get my card and you'll get the handout from me via your hosts. And some of the things, especially plant list type stuff, it's just hard to put in a PowerPoint, and I tend to make that in more of a conversation. All right, so actually I'm going to start from the paper because I have some fresh ones here. How useful / effective are the seeds from companies like Earthwise Seed that are supposed to replace lawn grass? This has been the question of the year. I've seen this all over the internet this year. I think the marketing has ramped up. You might see American Meadows. It's one of these companies. A lot of times what they're selling you is clover, which generally speaking in this area is not a native plant. It is just another plant that's not from here. So wood sorrel is also in your yard and looks like clover and is not clover. It's native and delicious, also very tart. But the clovers and other mixes like that, the big problem is you can't maintain a monoculture in nature. So if you try to have one monoculture replacing another monoculture, that means all the same plant, you're fighting against natural processes. Most plants do not want to be walked on, like most organisms. So turf grass is very unique in that it is steppable and it won't die. So in general, that's just not a functional strategy. I would recommend make garden beds, make pathways. You don't need, if you're playing ultimate frisbee in your front yard all the time, keep a grass lawn. That's what it's good for. But otherwise, it's just not a great thing. And generally speaking, for beginners, I don't recommend starting with seed that you scatter. It's just, there's more I could get into, but it is very challenging to do that. Certainly starting things from seed in winter sowing or other types of potting up is a great strategy and saves money. Although I have planted natives from the plant giveaways, I just don't know how to decide what to plant and create a beautiful space. So I will say, hopefully some of the resources I'm going to share will make it easier to say, well, I can pick from my selections by conditions, or I can pick things that are neat and I want to try out, and maybe it'll die, but I'm willing to chance it. The big thing I would say is I'm very happy to, do a consult. It's not a tremendously expensive thing. In fact, I have a locals discount. Anybody who goes here would be within that range. And you can just kind of get some help making some choices, understanding your space. I want to get rid of the weeds taking over my garden space in a natural way so I can plant more natives. What do you advise I do? Weeds are an indicator. They mean that the ground is eroding or is compacted and that you need more plants there. So they're actually useful to see where your weeds are. I have very few weeds in that lawn I showed you that I've converted because my garden is now 3 or 4 years old and has grown in. And where I see weeds, that tells me, I have a planting project I need to do. So I recommend you hand weed what you've got and then plant densely immediately afterward with native ground cover. That's the way to eventually stop weeds persistently, not just because you added mulch this year. My house has a ground cover with rocks on it, which was already there. How do I start a garden with that there? I recommend removing the rocks before spending more time on the garden. It's going to be a hindrance and a frustration otherwise. Also, rock ground cover is sort of a specialized thing. What happens is silt falls into the rock, which then essentially is soil to a new seed, and then you get weeds in it. And so it's not really a ground cover. It's more of like it's technically a top dressing. People like you see it at libraries sometimes. They have people that are maintaining that. That's how they're keeping it. It's not because it's a great ground cover. So unfortunately, it's just in the way of most of the work you'd want to do. How do I get my lilac bush to bloom? I genuinely only specialize in native plants, so I'm not familiar with lilacs to that degree, but it should be possible to find some help from some of our local gardening groups. The Master Gardeners, Ask Extension, all of those are at your disposal. Please suggest plants for a shaded area next to a treed area that can survive deer. I'm going to kind of address both of these in the first, both these first two questions together. So first, there are no deer-proof plants. They have found deer dead full of sticks. They will eat anything if they're hungry enough. Planting diversely, mixing in strong smelling like mint family plants can help. Imagine if you went to a buffet and they mixed all the food together. It just wouldn't be as appealing for grazing. And plant a lot. Plant as large and as dense a planting as you can. That will withstand deer better. Just like if you go to a meadow, you rarely see the whole meadow is gone because of deer. Usually they're picking and choosing plants that are easy for them to get. What can I plant in shady areas with pine needles? Plants that like dry environments and more acidic soil will be happy there. For me, white wood aster is a champion ground cover with high wildlife value, as all asters are. And for more plants, well, I'll get to that in a second. I would love to plant more native flowers, but I'd like to know which are good in the shade and spread slow / won't spread and take over my whole lawn and my whole area. Shade-loving plants are often somewhat slow to spread because there's less light energy coming in, so that sometimes is sort of self-solving. I think we've kind of talked about how actually providing space for things to spread is a good thing. If you're mowing your lawn, plants will not take over your lawn generally. My quick start guide has links to some plant resources, including sunlight exposure, soil type, and deer resistance. And again, if you want to dig into something specifically, no pun intended, I will be around afterward. These two are like two sides of the same coin, so I want to answer them together. A little bit redundant of the other stuff was on the slides, but these questions come from people that want to support stem nesting bees. I have seen stem nesting bees make use of my old stems in multiple years, so it does work if you do it. How high do I need to leave my plant stems in the fall, and when is it warm enough to chop them down in the spring? In the fall, I focus on ensuring fallen stems do not block pathways. I try to mess with my garden as little as possible in the fall, as there are many overwintering beneficial insects in there. Remember, we don't want to attract all these wonderful butterflies, and then in the fall we sweep them all up into bags and throw them away. That's not what pollinator gardening is about. You can cut the stems down more if you want to in the fall. It doesn't really matter as long as you've never cut them before. But you're in there and you're disturbing the garden, so something to think about. And then the process for spring garden prep and cleaning up. So I leave the leaf litter there indefinitely. It's doing great work for us. In mid-March, I cut down stems wherever I want to see, just fewer stems. It's more of an aesthetic thing. Next to paths, trim them as short as you need to for walking around. Deeper in, I tend to cut knee height, which is about 8 to 12 inches. Nice biometric whenever you're out there with your cutters. And some stems I leave indefinitely because they're fairly deep in the bed. They give the garden a little structure in the early spring when your stuff hasn't grown in yet. All right, so thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And we have a microphone.
Yes.
So.
It should be on now.
John.
Sorry.
I want to thank you too for coming out and talking to our group here. We try to excite people about native plants as much as we can. We also are, as a member of the congregations working with the National Wildlife Federation, we have a plant pledge. National Wildlife Federation will provide the plants if you pledge to plant native. You can pledge today. We have paper copies. We have a laptop with the page open. So if you haven't done it already, please do that before you leave. And May 4th is the date for picking up your plants. And we'll also have some garden maintenance that day. But I want to thank you very much. It's wonderful to know about a resource right here in Laurel that we all can rely on, and we hope to see you many more times.
Absolutely.
So did you want to have an open mic discussion, or?
Yeah, if someone wouldn't mind just passing the mic around to people that raise their hands, I can try to answer. And I don't know if anyone is on Zoom with questions, but I can certainly take those as well.
Well, first, thanks so much. I mean, I learned a lot and things to think about. If you're going to create or augment a garden in a home that you bought or a piece of community property, you have no idea what the soil is like. And like you said, rather than augmenting the soil, figure out what your soil is. So where nearby is a resource these days for getting soil samples evaluated?
That's a great question. The Maryland Extension used to do soil testing, and they no longer do. The two that I've heard recommended the most are Virginia Tech has a program, and also Penn State, the Pennsylvania side of things. That's the one that the Maryland Extension, I think, mostly refers people to. What I will actually point you to is there is a great Maryland Extension website about soil testing, and actually a colleague of mine, we went through CBLP at the same time, she has a video about how to do the soil test. So she goes around, takes some samples, and shows how you mail it away, and you'll want to indicate usually just flowers. That's the category that they put everything I do into, and then they come back. And I will say this about soil testing. I don't actually recommend you do it unless you're particularly interested, unless you see there's a problem. So for instance, if you're putting in lots of plants throughout your garden, there's one area where it's just dead all the time, you could think, oh, maybe there's some kind of pollution or impurity there, because they're going to send you back target numbers, and then, are we trying to hit those numbers? Are we, for me, the big thing is just try different things in the area, and you'll usually find something that will grow. But it can reveal a problem if there really is something going on. Again, impurities is mostly the thing. But you're right, a backfill is usually what our front lawns are made of, which is, kind of crunched up clay material and sometimes trash from construction.
So this is a curiosity question. I've seen a lot of advertisement for lawn companies, lawn maintenance companies that talk
True
about,
Green.
well, not True Green,
okay.
because I'm talking about the ones that say pure, organic, quote, don't panic, it's organic, purely organic, this and that. Does that mean they don't use any kind of herbicides, pesticides, chemicals that are damaging to the environment, or is it a crapshoot?
No, that does not mean they don't use the, there could be some benefits to going with organic versus conventional. Usually what those terms really mean, so like for instance, an inorganic fertilizer is a chemical fertilizer that's just sort of like raw nitrogen or raw phosphorus or something like that. An organic fertilizer would be compost, which is a little bit more biologically available, a little less harsh. They're both going to do similar things, and the same thing is true with pesticides. A good example is, certain types of acids could be, they'll kill you. They might be organic, they might be derived from an organic source, but they still, so it's less about what organic versus inorganic or whatever. It's more about what's the outcome. And the big outcome is spreading systemic pesticides or either herbicides or insecticides has a lot of collateral damage. And that's ultimately the issue, is that it's less about the chemical they're using and more about the practice. So weed and feed is spreading an herbicide all through your garden, or all through your lawn and garden probably. Mosquito spraying companies are spreading something that lands, it's a foliar application, and anything that lands on that is going to be affected, whether it's a mosquito or whether it's a bee. And I hate to say it, but like, they will 100% lie to you. We have so much evidence from gardeners who talk to these people, and they are just being told information. Maybe they don't know they're lying to you, but their employers do. And it's kind of hard to get around. They're really, conventional landscapers unfortunately use a lot of practices that harm wildlife.
So that's herbicides and pesticides. What about fertilizers?
So the main thing about fertilizers, and this goes more into what you'll learn in Baywise, is that the amount of fertilizer you apply needs to be commensurate with what your needs are. If you're purely a native plant gardener and you just have gardens that mimic wildlife, you never need to ever add a fertilizer, like ever. If you're trying to grow vegetables, adding fertilizer can be really beneficial, and the critical thing is to not over-fertilize and also not to allow storm water to wash that away into the storm system. So that's really the thing, is it's all about being conscious of what you're doing and what the impact is. So if I just built a raised bed for vegetables, put all kinds of, I actually used just compost and manure as fertilizer. But I didn't over-fertilize it. It's an initial load, and I'm gonna add it in every few years, but I'm not putting in more than I need. I'm not laying it out on all my garden beds, that kind of thing.
For grass?
So
It's clearly it's gonna have, run off into storms.
yes, yeah, so grass is basically an impermeable surface. It does not let water soak into it because the roots are too short and the ground is compacted. This is why there's so much interest in replacing lawn with more permeable garden area. The other thing about grass is that it's kind of like you've been growing corn in the same field for 50 years. We know what happens when that happens. Same thing with grass. All of the nutrients are depleted from that soil, and that's why you have so many weeds, because they're seeing compacted soil, they're seeing erosion, and they're seeing poor soil. That's where dandelions come in. That's their job, is to solve that and break up the soil again and add nutrients back in. So you can do organic, actual term organic lawn care. It usually involves top dressing with a lot of compost and other techniques. It's very expensive for the average homeowner. It's just not feasible. If you go to Glenstone Museum, they're actually doing it, and they have beautiful, immaculate lawns, but they literally have billions of dollars. So it's kind of a 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. Yeah, that's the best I can say. I'm not a lawn expert. Generally, I'm a unlawn expert, so that's more. I've not planted any lawn in my experience so far. Other questions?
Yeah, I wonder if you have any suggestions for dealing with, shady erosion, issues. So like, if you have slopes that are in shade and also, hard compacted soil, how would you deal with erosion issues there?
Absolutely. So often that occurs, especially, it may or may not be your situation, but it happens a lot when grass attempted to be grown there on a slope in the shade. Grass doesn't like shade. It's not like where we got it from, there was not shade where it was growing. Also, it doesn't really like wet environments very much. It will grow up more if there's a lot of sun, but generally speaking, water isn't great for most grasses, especially our native grasses. So you're basically having the wrong kind of plant in the wrong place. So what can we put there instead? Anything that loves shade and is a ground cover is a good option because it's going to start putting in roots. It's going to start stabilizing the soil. The thing to remember, I didn't really go over this, but native plants have much deeper roots than turf grass, but also than most ornamental plants as well. A 9-bark, which is more of a sun shrub, but it has 14-foot deep roots. So these plants are very good at grabbing the soil and holding it in place. For shade, this is probably dry shade because it's on a slope. One thing you can do that I think is really valuable is try to find that environment in the wild. Take a cue find a shady slope somewhere that is populated with native plants. You may have to go to a park somewhere. What I see when I do that, Christmas fern is very frequently on these slopes in shade. I already mentioned white wood aster. That's kind of my go-to answer for a lot of things because it is really effective at spread. It'll spread like crazy. It's got big leaves. It holds the ground. You can go with, I'm trying to think what else. Also, wild Virginia strawberry. It's our native strawberry. It does produce a small edible fruit. Don't buy it. Find someone that has tons of it and just pull some up, and you can plant that in. I would make sure you water in pretty well because it's going to be dry. Rain might not fall directly on it, but that's the first steps I would take. And again, just research dry shade. You'll find there's a lot of plants you can try.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't think it was working. What about full sun slope, hill, really, in full sun? Yeah.
All right.
That we can't grow
full sun
anything.
dry is where I live. Like, there's
Yeah.
no moisture on any part of my property, so it's just like I had to learn the plants that were not going to survive on that land. I do have over 100 species of plant on my little property, so there are many, many options to choose from. For stabilizing a slope, for dry shade, I think there are fewer options, but for sun and dry, you have a lot of options in the shrubs. Shrubs are great at stabilizing slope. Black chokeberry is apparently a really solid one that people use for slope stabilization. Honestly, just trying to think. Like I mentioned, golden Alexanders. It'll spread on its own eventually, but you can plant it densely as well. 9-bark, any of the big shrubs that will take up a lot of space eventually, they're going to put down a lot of roots and they're going to grab onto that soil. It can be challenging because you're having continuing erosion until the new plants have taken in. You can put down something like cocoa core netting, which exists, and it's for landscape management applications. I will say it's very annoying later because you have to weed through it, but it can be effective at stabilizing slopes while plants are growing in, especially if you're doing shrubs and you're not too concerned with it being immaculate and perfect when it comes to weeding. You just want to get those big plants in place. Obviously, trees are also great at stabilizing slopes, and tons of trees love dry. So. Oh, and I should mention grasses. I don't mention grasses a lot in this talk, but there are a lot of native grasses. I think they take a little bit more research to just understand them and how to use them, but slope stabilization would be great there. Sedges, Carex genus, are particularly like shade or wet environments, and they can be used in a similar capacity as well.
Hi, I have a ton of daffodils. Are they kind of like neutral? Should I try to remove some of them?
Yeah, daffodils are good. They're what you might call a non-contributor. They're not detractors. They actually, the way that they have developed and been selected for, I think both tulips and daffodils, they may not actually even produce nectar or pollen at this point. They're basically they just exist and then they replicate in bulbs. You can remove them if you don't like how they look. They're tough. They would be tough to remove actually if you wanted to. That you'll see like old house foundations where there's nothing else left and then there's just daffodils around. They'll be there for a million years. But they also come up before most everything else, and they're very upright. So they're also not really shading the ground and preventing like ephemerals from coming up. So I think they're kind of a neutral. All right. Well, I'll be around after if you have any weird, complicated questions. And again, reach out to me. I'd be happy to visit any of y'all. And yeah, thank you very much.